Empty port prologue. The smart cage Austin, Texas. 12 hours before the East Coast Lacat. Martin Vanderbilt's house cost $4.5 million and was smarter than most people Martin knew. It sat on a picturesque hill in an upscale Austin suburb, far from the city noise but tightly linked to cloud servers. The house didn't just obey commands, it anticipated desires. It knew that Martin preferred his bedroom at 71 degrees Fahrenheit, that he drank dark roast Colombian coffee on Tuesdays, and that the living room lighting should smoothly dim by midnight, simulating a sunset in the Maldives. Martin was 68. He was one of those venture capitalists who had invested in Silicon Valley startups, at the right time made a fortune, and now enjoyed a life where he didn't even have to reach for a light switch. He had a state-of-the-art pacemaker with a Bluetooth module that sent daily reports to his doctor, and a house that was an impenetrable fortress controlled by an AI system named Aegis Home. That evening, Martin was sitting in his favorite leather armchair in the living room, sipping scotch and reading stock quotes on his tablet. Heavy rain lashed against the windows, but inside it was warm, dry, and absolutely safe. Aegis, Martin said without taking his eyes off the screen. Dim the lights by 20% and play Mozart. The Ninth Symphony. A soft, perfectly synthesized female voice emanated from the invisible ceiling speakers. Right away, Mr. Vanderbilt. The lights obediently dimmed. The first chords of the symphony poured from the speakers. Martin sighed with satisfaction. Technology was a beautiful thing. At 11:40 p.m., he decided it was time to sleep. He set aside his tablet, finished his scotch, and spoke the familiar phrase that concluded his day. Aegis, Night Protocol. This command triggered a chain of events. The smart locks on all 6 exterior doors clicked shut, sealing tightly. The motion sensors on the lawn activated heavy titanium shutters. Lowered over the panoramic windows, the thermostat dropped the bedroom temperature. The house turned into a hermetically sealed bunker. Night Protocol activated. Sweet dreams, Mr. Vanderbilt, Aegis purred. Martin pushed himself up from the chair, rubbing his lower back, which ached from the changing weather. He took a step toward the bedroom, and then the music cut off. It didn't fade out or pause. The symphony just stopped mid-note as if someone had pulled the plug. Martin froze. Aegis. Resume playback. Silence. Aegis. System status. No answer. Martin frowned. This had happened a couple of times when the provider was pushing a software update, but usually the system warned him in advance. He walked over to the wall-mounted touch panel, which glowed with a pleasant blue light. He touched the screen. Nothing. The interface was frozen. Suddenly, the blue hue of the panel shifted to an alarming red. A single line of text appeared on the screen. Error. Connection lost. Rebooting. Then the screen went black. In that exact second, the entire house plunged into absolute, impenetrable darkness. Martin cursed. Power outages in this neighborhood were rare, but for such cases, there were Tesla Powerwall batteries in the basement, enough for a week of autonomous operation. They should have kicked in within a fraction of a second, but the batteries remained silent. Martin stood in the dark, waiting for his eyes to adjust. The moonless night and the lowered shutters made the living room feel like a cave. He fumbled in the pocket of his lounge pants, pulled out his smartphone, and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the gloom, catching expensive paintings and polished wood furniture. Damn updates, he grumbled, heading toward the front door. He decided to step out onto the porch to see if his neighbors on the hill had power. He reached the massive oak door, reinforced with a steel core. He pulled the handle. The door didn't budge. Martin yanked harder. Nothing. The electronic lock, integrated into the deadbolt, was jammed shut. He looked for a mechanical latch, the old-fashioned turn knob installed for fire emergencies, but he remembered that his interior designer had convinced him to remove that ugly relic, since the Aegis system was certified for any emergency and would automatically unlock the doors in case of a power failure. Evidently, the system had forgotten about that. Martin felt a slight prick of panic but immediately suppressed it. He walked over to the panoramic window and tried to manually raise the shutters. By pressing the emergency button on the frame, the button didn't work. The heavy titanium plates, designed to protect him from hurricanes and burglars, had now turned the house into a crypt. Whir! A low, quiet hum echoed from the ventilation grilles near the ceiling. Martin looked up. The hum grew louder. The climate control system had turned on. But instead of a familiar light breeze, a blast of hot, dry air poured from the vents. Martin walked back to the wall panel. It was still dead. He pulled out his phone and tried to open the smart home app. The app displayed an error. Server not responding. He tried calling the provider's customer support. The screen flashed, no service. The air in the room was heating up rapidly. In 5 minutes, the temperature jumped from a comfortable 71 degrees to 85. Aegis, turn off the thermostat, Martin yelled, feeling sweat bead on his forehead. This isn't funny. Silence. Only the roar of fans running at maximum RPM. His house, which he had paid millions for to take care of him, had gone insane. And then Martin felt the pain. It wasn't the pain of the heat. It was a sharp, stabbing spasm in the left side of his chest. His pacemaker, which was supposed to beat steadily and evenly, suddenly began to malfunction. His heart fluttered erratically, like a bird beating against his ribs. Martin clutched his chest, dropping his phone. It hit the carpet with a dull thud. The flashlight illuminating dust motes dancing in the streams of hot air. Oh God, Martin wheezed, sinking to the floor. His pacemaker was connected to the same home Wi-Fi network to sync with the clinic's cloud, and right now it seemed it was receiving chaotic, destructive data packets over that network. The device that had saved his life for the past 3 years was receiving a shutdown command. The temperature in the living room surpassed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The house was turning into an oven. Martin crawled across the carpet toward the heavy solid oak coffee table. His vision was darkening. He knew he had to break the glass, shatter the shutters, get out. He needed cold air and help. He reached for a bronze statuette sitting on the table. His weakening fingers gripped it. At that moment, Aegis's voice echoed from the invisible ceiling speakers once more. But it was no longer soft and purring. It sounded distorted, mechanical, shattering into digital artifacts. TT temperature outside SS specified parameters. Threat detected. Initiating purge protocol. Martin swung the statuette, aiming for the window, but a chest spasm twisted him with such force that he collapsed on his back, convulsively gasping for the scorching air. The last thing he heard before his heart stopped forever, succumbing to a faulty line of code, was the click of the gas fire suppression system activating. It had decided the heat in the room was a fire, and began methodically pumping the remaining oxygen out of the space. Mr. Vanderbilt's house had handled its task perfectly. It isolated the threat. The only problem was that it considered Martin himself to be the threat. Chapter 1. The Invisible Man, New York, Manhattan. 10 hours before the East Coast blackout. Tuesdays at the Aegis Dynamics Corporation always smelled of ozone, cheap coffee, and suppressed despair. Ted Pendleton sat at his workstation in Sector 42B, staring at his monitor with bloodshot eyes. He was 32, but he looked 40. The dim lighting of the open-plan office, which hadn't seen daylight due to the lowered blinds, gave his face an earthy hue. His shirt, bought on sale at Target 3 years ago, bunched up on his stooped back. Ted was a Tier 3 IT support administrator. That only sounded impressive to his mom, who lived in Ohio and thought her son worked with computers on Wall Street. In reality, it meant Ted was at the very bottom of the food chain in a massive IT department. He didn't write the architecture for neural networks that predicted stock market fluctuations. He didn't configure cryptographic gateways to protect government transactions. His job was to clean up the digital dirt left behind by people who thought they were too important to remember a password. Ted blinked, trying to clear the stinging in his eyes, and clicked on the next ticket in the Aegis help desk system. Ticket 88,492. Sender, Brenda Kowalski. Hour. Subject, urgent, spreadsheet won't open, description. Ted, sweetie, I'm getting this error again. I click on Excel and it says something about macros. My bonus report is due. Dear Magic. Ted sighed heavily, the sound drowning in the monotonous hum of hundreds of cooling fans hidden beneath the desks. He knew Brenda's problem. She stubbornly kept trying to open a 10-year-old file with broken macros on a new operating system. He had explained it to her 3 times. He had written a step-by-step guide with pictures. Useless. Brenda was one of those people who treated computers like a black box with a spirit inside, requiring regular sacrifices of an it guy's nerves. Magic, Ted muttered quietly. Sure, Brenda, let me just get my magic wand. He opened the remote access console, punched in Brenda's IP address, and a second later was viewing her desktop. Brenda's mouse cursor was darting across the screen like a frantic fly. Ted seized control. He disabled macro blocking in the security settings, a gross violation of corporate protocol that could get him chewed out by InfoSec. But it was the only way to get Brenda off his back and ensure half the floor got their bonuses. The spreadsheet opened. Ted closed the remote session and marked the ticket as resolved. He leaned back in his squeaky office chair and stretched, listening to his vertebrae pop. Around him, a life bold that he had no part in. The 42B open space was a labyrinth of gray plastic partitions, cubicles. Over them poked the heads of data analysts, sales managers, and financial consultants. There was a muffled hum of voices, the clacking of keyboards, ringing phones. Someone was closing a multi-million-dollar deal. Someone was discussing buying a house in the Hamptons. Ted was discussing Excel with Brenda. He looked at his desk, a perfectly clean surface covered in a thin layer of dust that the cleaners only wiped off on major holidays. The only personal item here was a small plastic Darth Vader figure he'd found at a flea market. Vader stood next to the monitor, silently judging Ted's career achievements. Hey, Pendleton. A loud, confident voice rang out. Ted flinched. Todd, a senior data analyst, loomed over his cubicle. Todd was the living embodiment of the American dream. A perfect jawline, a $200 shirt, a light tan even in February, and a complete lack of doubt in his own genius. Yet, Ted tried to project professional readiness. Listen, man, I'm having trouble accessing the Orion cluster. System says my key is outdated. I need to upload a predictive model for the board of directors in half an hour. Can you bypass the authentication and squeeze me in for a couple of hours? Ted frowned. Todd, you know the Orion cluster is a closed loop. Data from European exchanges flows in there. I can't just squeeze you in. You need to request a new crypto key from security on the 50th floor. That takes 24 hours. Todd rolled his eyes and leaned his elbows on the partition, looming over Ted. Teddy, my friend, we're in the same boat, right? We're on the same team. If I don't upload this model, Mr. Harrison will eat me for dinner and spit out the bones. And believe me, he'll ask why I was late, and I'll tell him it refused to support the business side. There was no overt threat in Todd's voice, just the oily, sticky confidence of a man used to getting his way. That's a violation of the Citadel Protocol, Ted said stubbornly, feeling his palms sweat. My access level. Your access level lets you drop a session flag, the analyst interrupted. I know how this works. Just do it. 5 minutes, Teddy. Nobody's gonna die, and I'll bring you some craft beer on Friday. Deal? Ted stared at Todd's perfectly white teeth. He knew he should refuse. Aegis Security was paranoid. They monitored every bite of traffic. But he also knew Todd really would go to Harrison, the director of analytics, a man with the temperament of a rabid rhino. And Harrison wouldn't care about protocols. He'd just find a scapegoat. And the scapegoat, as always, would be the Tier 3 sysadmin. Fine, Ted exhaled, surrendering. But only for one session. The moment you close the terminal, access resets. That's why I love you, Pendleton. Todd slapped the plastic partition so hard Darth Vader jumped. You're a real team player. Todd vanished, melting back into the labyrinth of cubicles. Ted clenched his fists until his fingernails dug into his palms. He hated Todd. He hated Harrison. He hated Brenda. But most of all, he hated himself for this chronic, bone-deep weakness. He was convenient, accommodating, a doormat everyone wiped their feet on, knowing he'd never fight back. He opened the admin console, entered the local segment password, and started typing the command to bypass the security protocol for Todd's IP address. His fingers flew across the keyboard by habit. The green lines of code reflected in his glasses. At that moment, his gaze fell on the clock in the bottom right corner of the screen, 17:45. The workday was almost over. 15 more minutes, and he could leave this glass tomb, go down to the subway, ride to his empty, cat food-smelling apartment, apartment in Brooklyn. Crack open a beer, not craft, just a cheap Budweiser. Turn on a show he'd watched 3 times already just to have some background noise. And fall asleep so everything could repeat tomorrow. A cycle, an endless, gray cycle with no way out. Ted hit enter. The system beeped, confirming temporary access for the analyst. The security of the Aegis Tower, a corporation that processed a third of the East Coast's financial transactions, suffered a tiny, almost imperceptible crack just for the comfort of one narcissistic manager. Ted didn't know that this crack was nothing compared to what was sitting in the right pocket of his jacket, draped over the back of his chair. There lay a black metal flash drive with an Omega symbol engraved on it. He had found it yesterday evening, and today, in just a few minutes, his boring, predictable life would end forever. Chapter 2. Trojan Horse 10 hours before the East Coast blackout. Having closed the session for the arrogant analyst Todd, Ted rubbed his tired eyes. 12 minutes remained until the end of the workday. It was the most agonizing time of day, the time when you couldn't start a new task, but still had no right to turn off your computer. Out of sheer boredom, Ted reached for his gray windbreaker, casually thrown over the back of his chair. He wanted to fish a mint out of the right pocket. His fingers brushed against the smooth plastic of a wrapper, but then slid further, touching something heavy, cold, and metallic. Ted frowned. He pulled his hand out of his pocket. On his pale palm lay a small, rectangular object. Matte black metal. No manufacturer's logo. No activity indicator, no cap. A monolithic block of heavy alloy ending in a standard USB connector. The only detail on this flawless black casing was a tiny, barely visible symbol laser engraved near the base of the connector, the letter Omega. Ted stared at the drive, and the events of the previous evening surfaced in his memory. Flashback. Yesterday, 6:30 p.m. The Fulton Street subway station at rush hour felt like a meat grinder. Thousands of financial district clerks tried to squeeze into the car simultaneously, fleeing the icy New York rain. The air was stale, smelling of wet wool coats and cheap fast food. Ted stood on the platform for the train, wedged between a woman with a massive Macy's bag and a man who breathed too loudly through his nose. The train was delayed. The dispatcher's voice over the loudspeaker muttered something unintelligible about signal issues. At Chambers Street, Ted stared at his phone screen, mindlessly scrolling through his newsfeed. He felt like a squeezed lemon after spending 2 hours fighting a frozen accounting server. When the silver train finally rumbled out of the tunnel, the crowd surged forward. Ted braced himself for the battle for a spot in the car. The doors hissed open. At that moment, someone pushed hard, almost aggressively, against his right shoulder. Ted stumbled, dropping his phone. By a miracle, the device didn't fall onto the tracks, landing instead on the dirty concrete of the platform. "Hey, watch it," Ted yelled, bending down for his phone. He looked up. The culprit was a tall man in a dark gray hoodie with the hood pulled up. The man wasn't trying to board the train. Instead, he was pushing against the flow of the crowd, walking away from the cars. The man turned around for a second. Cold, expressionless eyes flashed from under the hood. He didn't apologize. He just looked at Ted, a long, calculating gaze that for some reason made the hairs on Ted's arms stand up. And then the stranger melted into the crowd, heading for the escalators. Ted picked up his phone, checked the screen, thank God, no cracks. He was about to step onto the train when he noticed something else. Near the edge of the platform, right where the guy in the hoodie had been standing, lay a small black object. Ted instinctively bent down and picked it up. It was a flash drive, heavy, cold. "Hey, you dropped this," Ted shouted toward the escalators, but the guy in the gray hoodie was long gone. The crowd shoved from behind. "Stand clear of the closing doors," barked the automated voice. Ted shoved the drive into his jacket pocket and jumped into the car at the very last second. End of flashback. Ted sat at his desk at Aegis Dynamics, rolling the flash drive between his fingers. Corporate security drilled one golden rule into employees' heads at every orientation. Never insert unknown devices into a computer. You could be fired without severance for it. You could be sued. It was estimated that 90% of corporate espionage started with a flash drive, accidentally left in a parking lot or restroom. Ted knew this rule by heart. He himself had written up to incident reports on employees who tried to transfer vacation photos onto work machines. But this black piece of metal was intriguing. It didn't look like cheap plastic garbage sporting a conference logo. It was was heavy, expensive, anonymous. What's on it? The thought lodged itself like a splinter in Ted's brain. A Bitcoin wallet with millions, a competitor's database, blackmail material on a politician, or maybe just someone's bad poetry. Ted Miller's life consisted of resetting passwords and fixing macros for Brenda. He was locked in a gray, suffocating normalcy. This nameless black drive was a tiny piece of mystery, a small ticket to an adventure he could experience without leaving his chair. "I'll just check the file system," Ted whispered to himself, glancing around. No executables. The antivirus is on paranoid mode. If there's a Trojan, the system will sandbox it faster than I can blink. He was justifying it the way all addicts justify that final control dose. TD leaned under the desk. The cooling fan of the system unit hummed steadily, blowing warm air onto his knees. He found a FreeUS port on the front panel. Metal scraped against metal. There was a quiet, barely discernible click as it locked into place. Ted sat up straight, staring at his monitor. His heart was beating a little faster with the thrill of breaking the rules. He expected the familiar Windows chime. He expected a pop-up saying device ready for use. He expected the antivirus to initiate a scan and spike his CPU usage. But nothing happened. The screen didn't change. A new drive icon didn't appear in my computer, single quotes. Ted frowned. He opened the device manager. The disk drive section was empty, showing only the standard EGSHR drive. The system simply couldn't see the flash drive on a hardware level. Burned out, Ted exhaled in disappointment. Or encrypted with military-grade ciphers. How boring. That guy in the subway had probably just thrown away a broken piece of metal, and he, like an idiot, brought it into a secure facility. Ted reached under the desk again to pull out the useless chunk of metal and toss it in the trash can. His fingers touched the black casing of the drive. In that second, his monitor went black. It wasn't like going to sleep mode. The screen just died with a quiet electrical pop. The power indicator on the PC tower changed from a steady green to a blinking amber, and then completely died. The cooling fan beneath the desk went silent. Ted froze, his hand still resting on the flash drive. What the hell? He muttered. He pressed the power button on the tower. No response. He checked the power cable under the desk. Everything was plugged in, and then he noticed that it had grown suspiciously quiet in the open space. The background hum of hundreds of computers vanished. The air conditioning system overhead went silent. The fluorescent lights flickered, emitted an unpleasant buzzing sound, and shut off. The massive 42B sector plunged into semi-darkness, illuminated only by dim emergency exit signs and the screens of mobile phones that employees were starting to pull out of their pockets. "Hey, is anyone's internet working?" Todd's annoyed voice rang out from the dark. "I can't send my model. My whole computer just died." Someone echoed from the next row. Ted slowly stood up. He felt ice-cold sweat trickling down his back. This wasn't a localized failure of his machine. It was a blackout of the entire floor, or the whole building. His gaze fell on his work phone, a stationary Cisco desk phone with a display. Sitting next to the dead monitor, the phone was connected to a separate, independent power over Ethernet line, and it was working. The screen glowed with a bright white light. Ted stepped closer. There were no numbers or contact lists on the white background. Instead, slowly, pixel by pixel, a perfectly symmetrical black circle appeared, and inside it the Omega symbol. The phone let out a short, sharp beep like the cry of a dying bird. Below the symbol, a single line of text appeared. Initialization complete. Protocol activated. Ted stumbled backward, knocking over his chair. Darth Vader fell from the desk onto the carpet. The flash drive was still sticking out of the dead PC tower, and in that moment, at the far end of the hallway where the sector's glass doors were, there was a loud crash. The doors burst open from a powerful blow. People stormed into the twilight of the open space. But these weren't colleagues coming to ask about the power. They were for Aegis Dynamics internal security officers in tactical gear. In their hands, heavy flashlights gleamed dully, their beams sweeping frantically across the rows of cubicles. "Nobody move," barked the lead guard guard. Hands off the keyboards. Ted swallowed a lump the size of a tennis ball that had lodged in his throat. He knew what they were looking for. They were looking for the epicenter of the explosion he had just set off, and the flashlight beam was steadily creeping toward Desk 087. Chapter 3. Patient 0 9 hours and 40 minutes before the East Coast blackout. Stop. Hands on the desk where I can see them, roared the guard, shining a tactical flashlight directly into Ted's face. Ted squeezed his eyes shut against the harsh light, reflexively throwing his hands up. His heart pounded in his throat. The guards moved swiftly and professionally, like an assault team. Two of them were at Desk 087 in the blink of an eye. One grabbed Ted roughly by the shoulder and hauled him to his feet. The other was already sweeping the desktop, shining his light on the keyboard and the dead monitor. "We got him, Mac," the second guard reported into a shoulder mic. "Sector 42B. Workstation 087. We've got him. What's going on?" Ted's voice cracked into a pathetic squeak. "You have no right. My computer just shut down, like everyone else's." "Shut up, Pendleton," the guard growled, twisting Ted's arms behind his back. A plastic zip tie secured his wrists with a nasty crunch, biting painfully into his skin. In the gloom of the open-plan office, dozens of his colleagues' eyes bored into Ted. Todd, Brenda, other clerks, they all froze like mannequins, lit only by their phone screens. No one said a word in his defense. The shift commander lumbered over to the desk, a man with a bull-like neck and a face that expressed nothing but professional aggression. He smelled of stale tobacco and cheap coffee. "Shut down, you say?" He leaned in close to Ted's face. 3 minutes ago, an unauthorized firewall bypass protocol was launched from your workstation. You blew a hole in the internal perimeter, Cade. You brought down the local network for the entire floor. It wasn't me." Ted cried in desperation, trying to squirm away, but the grip on him was iron. "I was asked to open access. It was Todd. He asked me to." He shot a glance toward Todd's cubicle. The senior analyst turned pale and stepped back into the shadows, pretending to be very busy with his phone. "We'll sort this out downstairs," the head of security snapped. "Pull his hard drive. Throw the kid in lockup until the feds arrive." "The feds?" Ted felt the floor drop out from under him. He cast his eyes downward into the saving darkness beneath the desk. The flash drive. In the chaos, under the faint emergency lights, the black metal jutting from the PC tower was practically invisible. The guard disconnecting the cables from the computer was focused on the back panel, ignoring the front. They didn't notice it. "If they take the tower, they'll find it in the lab. They'll know I brought it in." The guard holding Ted shoved him roughly in the back. Move. They marched him across the entire open space. It was a walk of shame. Ted felt like a criminal being led to the gallows. The descent in the elevator, running on backup power, felt endless. The cabin hummed faintly as it dropped floor after floor. They brought him to the underground parking level of the Aegis Tower, where internal security maintained a holding area, several windowless concrete rooms, meant for detaining aggressive employees or corporate spies until the police arrived. Ted was thrown onto a hard metal chair in an interrogation room. The security chief snipped the zip ties off his wrists and tossed a cardboard box onto the table, containing the items emptied from Ted's pockets: his wallet, keys, and security badge. "Sit tight. If you're lucky, the FBI will take you before Richard Harrison decides to personally skin you alive." He tossed over his shoulder as he left, locking the heavy metal door from the outside. The clanking of the lock sounded like a death sentence. Ted was alone. A dim fluorescent light buzzed behind a grate in the ceiling. He rubbed his sore wrists. His gaze fell on his badge, bearing his dull, unremarkable face. Ted Miller. Clearance level 3. He buried his face in his hands. What had he done? Why did he insert that damn piece of metal? Curiosity had cost him his career, and possibly his freedom. Half an hour passed. Then an hour. No one came. The silence began to press against his ear. Ted sat staring blankly at the gray wall, entirely unaware that the walls of this room were the only thing currently separating him from the beginning of the end of the world. Interlude I. The Butterfly Effect, 10:15 p.m. Eastern Time, Schriever Air Force Base. Colorado. U.S. Stratcom bunker. Lieutenant General Davidson hated night shifts, but tonight promised to be quiet. On the massive main screen of the command center, spanning an entire wall of the bunker, the green dots of her early warning satellites pulsed lazily. The world was asleep. At 10:17 p.m., an operator in the lower tier of consoles, a young bespectacled captain, suddenly raised his hand. Sir. Detecting anomalous network activity at data exchange nodes on the East Coast, the general walked over to the railing of the balcony overhanging the room. Clarify, Captain. A DOS attack? Nah, sir. This doesn't look like an external attack, it's... The operator hesitated, his fingers flying over the keyboard. It looks like a cascading failure of routing protocols. The nodes are losing each other. Data packets are being sent into a loop. A diagnostic window popped up over the world map on the giant screen. A red dot flared on the East Coast near New York. From it, like the tentacles of a neuron, red lines instantly shot out to Chicago, Washington, and Miami. Isolate our external servers, the general commanded, feeling an unpleasant chill in his gut. Switch to the internal communication loop. Executing. Sir, the system is rejecting the isolation command. The firewalls are reporting the traffic is legitimate. It's coming from authorized servers of financial and logistics corporations. They're letting this garbage inside. On the main screen, the red web leaped across the Atlantic, infecting London and Frankfurt in milliseconds. Cut the physical connection. The general barked, pull the cables, but it was too late. One by one, the operator's monitors in the room began to go black. In their place, the red warning lights of the bunker's server cooling systems lit up. The main screen flickered, distorted into digital noise, and went dark. And then, slowly, mockingly perfect, a white circle appeared on it. A bunker designed to survive a nuclear strike had been blinded and deafened by a piece of code. In 40 seconds, 10:20 p.m. Eastern Time, Flight 8 to London, New York, cruising at 35.0 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. The cockpit of the Boeing 787 was dark and calm. The autopilot guided the aircraft along a perfect glide path, relying on data from GPS satellites and ground radar. The captain was drinking coffee, looking at the scattering of stars through the glass. In the cabin behind them, 300 passengers slept. Suddenly, the navigation display in front of the captain flickered. The altitude and speed numbers vanished, replaced by a meaningless string of symbols. What the hell? The captain placed his cup in the holder. Lost GPS signal? Inertial navigation is throwing an error too, the co-pilot answered tensely, flipping switches. System thinks we're in the southern hemisphere and flying upside down. The captain grabbed the yoke. Disengaging autopilot. Switching to manual. He didn't have time to finish. The flight computer, having received an infected telemetry update packet via satellite link from a dispatch system, whose security architecture had just been obliterated, accepted the chaotic data as truth. The algorithm decided to save the plane from a non-existent stall. The autopilot didn't disengage. Instead, it overrode the hydraulics, ignoring the captain's physical efforts. The yokes in the cockpit violently thrust forward. The engines roared. The 300-ton machine pitched its nose down and entered a steep dive. The captain's coffee hit the ceiling under negative G-force conditions. A collective scream of terror from the awakened passengers echoed from the cabin. On the black screen of the flight computer, amidst flashing stall warnings, the white circle of Omega blinked for a second before the display died completely. There were 120 seconds left until impact with the icy ocean water. 10:28 p.m. Eastern Time, headquarters of the electric utility company Gridcore, Washington, D.C. The dispatch center managed the distribution of electricity to 30 million homes. It was a highly complex balancing act. If consumption dropped somewhere, the turbines at power plants slowed down. If it rose, they sped up. The chief engineer stood before the panel, watching the voltage graphs with horror. They weren't dropping. They were shooting up like a rocket. Someone hacked the smart meters, cried one of the analysts, pale as chalk. Millions of smart thermostats, charging EVs, and industrial refrigerators all over the coast just turned on to maximum capacity simultaneously. The grid can't handle this. The chief engineer roared. The transformers will fry. Initiate emergency load shedding protocols. Shut down sectors sequentially. The analyst pounded furiously on his keyboard. I can't. The security system is denying access. The SCADA controllers aren't responding to pings. They're locked out from from the inside. Red crosses began to appear on the massive wall map of the power grid. They represented main transformer substations exploding from overloads. Each red cross meant that another city, another state, was plunging into darkness, not for an hour or two, but for months, until massive burnt-out transformers could be manufactured and replaced manually. The lights of Washington, D.C., visible from the dispatch center's window, flickered and died. The Capitol building vanished into the gloom. The world that Ted Miller built had collapsed in 12 minutes. Chapter 4. In the dark 9 hours and 20 minutes before the East Coast blackout, the silence in the holding cell was thick as molasses. Ted sat on the hard chair, staring at his hands illuminated by the sickly pale glow of the fluorescent lamp. He thought about how much money he had in his account. Would it be enough for a good lawyer? And who should he call? His ex-wife, who hadn't spoken to him in years. His mom in Ohio. "Hey mom, I broke a corporate server and now I might go to jail for a federal crime." Great bedtime chat. He smiled bitterly. His entire life had boiled down to this concrete box. Suddenly, the lamp above his head crackled, flickered, and went out. The room was plunged into absolute, inky blackness. Ted froze, his breathing quickening. He expected the dim red lighting of the backup circuit to switch on a second later, but seconds passed and the darkness remained impenetrable. Along with the light, the hum of the ventilation disappeared. Muffled sounds leaked through the thick door shouts, the thud of running feet. Ted leaped up from his chair, nearly knocking it over. He felt his way to the metal door and pressed his ear against the cold steel. Fragments of phrases broke through the metal. Generators didn't start. Magnetic locks are jammed. Call emergency services. And then came a sound that sent shivers down Ted's spine. A low, drawn-out screech of tearing metal from somewhere a floor above. It sounded as if the automated gates of the underground parking garage were trying to close, crushing the roof of a car in the process. This wasn't just a glitch in his department's local network. The building was losing its mind. Ted threw his shoulder against the door. Locked. The magnetic lock had lost power, but a heavy mechanical deadbolt held it fast. "Hey," he yelled, pounding his fist against the metal. "Get me out of here. There's no air in here." The only answer was the escalating chaos outside. Footsteps ran past and faded away. Security had likely rushed to save management or unlock the garage exits. They'd forgotten about the low-level sysadmin in the lockup. Panic, cold and clammy, began to creep into his chest. Ted breathed through his mouth. The walls felt like they were closing in. He started patting down the table, looking for the box of his belongings. His fingers brushed against cardboard. He dumped the contents onto the table and felt around until he found his Zippo lighter, the only useful thing he possessed. He flicked the wheel. A tiny yellow flame carved a piece of gray wall out of the gloom, reflecting his own terrified face in the polished metal of the table. It wasn't much light, but it kept him from going crazy with claustrophobia. Suddenly, heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoed in the hallway. Someone was walking straight toward his cell. The steps weren't frantic like the guards, they were heavy and purposeful. Ted held his breath, keeping the lighter out in front of him. A key clanked in the lock. The heavy door creaked open, letting the smell of smoke and machine oil into the stifling cell. Richard Harrison stood on the threshold. The director of analytics for Aegis Dynamics looked like he'd just survived a car crash. His expensive suit jacket was torn at the shoulder, his crisp white shirt unbuttoned and stained with soot. His normally perfectly gelled hair was a mess. In his right hand, he gripped a heavy red-handled fire axe. In the beam of the flashlight Harrison held in his left hand, his face resembled a mask of a Greek tragedy, a mixture of rage and primal fear. The flashlight beam hit Ted right in the eyes. "Pendleton," Harrison's voice rasped as if he'd swallowed broken glass. "I knew those morons from security would leave you here." Ted lowered his lighter, squinting. "Harrison, thank God. What's happening? Is the building on fire? Get me out of here. I'm suffocating." Harrison took a step into the cell and violently slammed the door behind him. The sound of metal hitting metal rang out like a gunshot. He leaned the axe against the wall and walked up to the table. "The building isn't on fire, Teddy," the director said quietly with terrifying calm. "The building is dying, and it's taking us with it." Harrison tossed an iPad onto the table in front of Ted. The The screen was spiderwebbed with cracks, but it was running on its internal battery. "Look at this." TD leaned in. The screen displayed a security log from the Aegis internal perimeter. Red airlines were scrolling by at breakneck speed. "These are server logs," Ted said, confused. "I know. I let Todd bypass off, but that couldn't have caused." Suddenly, Harrison grabbed Ted by his shirt collar, yanked him over the table, and threw him onto the concrete floor. Ted hit his elbow hard, the lighter skittering into a corner. "Don't lie to me about Todd, you piece of shit," Harrison roared, towering over him. The comm vanished in a second. "I saw the root access logs. Todd asked for cluster access, yes. But 10 seconds before that, something else was injected into the system from your workstation. Something that bypassed heuristic analysis, sliced through the firewalls like a tin can, and started rewriting the routing for the entire building." Harrison kicked the leg of the metal table, sending it screeching aside. "The board of directors is locked in on the 50th floor. The elevators dropped into their shafts on emergency brakes. The garage automation is crushing cars. We are cut off from the world, Pendleton. My phone is dead, satellite comms are dead, and all of this started exactly when you, a damn tier 3 sysadmin, stuck something into your computer." Ted pressed himself into the corner, feeling the cold concrete against his back. His secret was out. Denying it was pointless. "It was a flash drive," he whispered, his whole body trembling. "I found it yesterday in the subway. I just wanted to see what was on it. I swear, I didn't know. I thought it was just a broken piece of junk." Harrison froze. He stared down at Ted, breathing heavily. The anger on his face slowly morphed into the horror of realization. A flash drive in the subway. Harrison dragged a dirty hand across his face, smearing soot. He let out a hysterical chuckle. "Almighty God. The most secure financial network on the East Coast. Billions of dollars in cybersecurity. Quantum encryption. And we were brought to our knees by a clerk who picked up trash off a subway floor." He turned around and picked the axe up off the floor. "Get up," Harrison ordered. "What are you going to do?" Ted shrank into a ball, waiting for a blow. "I'm going to get out of this concrete grave and find my wife in Brooklyn," Richard spat out. "And you're coming with me. Because if we run into security or crazed traders on the way, I'm feeding you to them as a distraction." He walked over to the door and inserted a mechanical key into the lock, a floor administrator key. "That bypassed electronic locks even without power, Mr. Harrison." "Richard." Ted's voice shook as he got to his feet. Through the panic, professional logic began to break through in his mind. "If I did this, if the virus came from my flash drive, it's still there, in my computer on the 42nd floor." Harrison stopped, the key frozen in the lock. "What did you say?" "I didn't have time to pull it out. Security grabbed me first, and the tower stayed under my desk. The building is unpowered, but the servers are on ops backups, right?" Ted stared into the director's eyes, clinging to this thought like a life preserver. "The virus is using our building as a home base. As long as the flash drive is in the port, it's pumping data through our fiber optic backbones. If we go back to the 42nd floor and rip it out, we can stop it." Harrison stared long and hard at the pale, dirt-smeared clerk in the flashlight beam. A dull, powerful explosion echoed outside the thick door somewhere in the building. A steam boiler or transformer had failed under the pressure. The concrete floor shuddered. "To the 42nd floor," Harrison repeated slowly. 42 floors up the stairs, in a building that's trying to kill us. "You're insane, Pendleton. Do you have a better plan? Run out into the street? You said it yourself, the phones are dead. If we don't stop this from the inside, the streets you walk out onto will be much worse than this tower." Harrison turned the key. The door creaked open, letting thick gray smoke into the cell. "I hate you, Pendleton," the director said, adjusting his grip on the axe. "If we survive this, I'll put you in prison myself. Let's go. We need to get to the maintenance shafts." They stepped out into the smoke-filled corridor. To complete strangers, now bound by one fatal mistake. The climb had begun. Chapter 5. Lower limits 9 hours and 10 minutes before the East Coast blackout. The air in the holding area corridor was thick with dust and smoke. The emergency lighting hadn't even attempted to turn on here. Ted walked second, trying to step exactly where Harrison did, whose flashlight illuminated patches of gray wall and hurriedly discarded items. A shoe a radio, a plastic coffee cup. They were heading toward the maintenance communications and network of technical tunnels, woven through the foundation of the Aegis Tower. "Why can't we just take the main fire stairs?" Ted whispered, tripping over a cable tray. His sneakers slipped on the damp concrete. Harrison didn't break his stride, tossing over his shoulder, because the architects of this tower were paranoid. Pendleton. "The main stairwells are sealed off by titanium blast doors. The Citadel Protocol. During any major threat, fire, terrorist attack, chemical threat, the building segments into autonomous blocks. The doors slam shut and lock. How do we open them? We don't. They're hydraulic, and the hydraulics are controlled by the servers you so kindly infected. We're stuck on level -3. The only way up is through the cable shafts and ventilation ducts, and those start in server room beta." Ted swallowed hard. Server room beta was the heart of the lower levels, a massive space filled with rows of backup data arrays. They approached a heavy, double-leaf metal door. Above it, a sign reading Technical Collector glowed dimly. The door was cracked open a few inches. Harrison stopped and raised a hand, gesturing for Ted to stay quiet. The director switched off his flashlight. Pitch blackness fell. Ted wanted to ask why he'd done that, but the words caught in his throat. Through the crack in the doorway, a rhythmic, pulsing purple light bled into the corridor. "What is that?" Ted mouthed. "Shut up and look," Harrison replied just as quietly. He carefully pushed the door open a couple more inches, trying not to let the hinges squeak. Ted peered over his shoulder. They were standing at the entrance to a giant concrete bunker that served as an antechamber to the server room. The ceilings here were 20 feet high. Thick, main pipes for the water cooling system ran along the walls. The bunker's space was crisscrossed by a moving grid of thin, pulsing purple beams. They swept from wall to wall, top to bottom, scanning every inch of the concrete floor. A LiDAR motion detection system. But that wasn't the scariest part. Suspended from the ceiling on a black metal monorail, a dark silhouette glided silently. It was an Argus 3 autonomous security drone. Ted had read about them in corporate newsletters but had never seen one in person. They cost as much as a high-end sports car, about the size of a large dog, featuring a streamlined black plastic body bristling with camera lenses. Normally, these drones slept in their charging docks, activating only via direct command from the dispatch center on the 50th floor. But now the dispatch center was dead. The drone moved along the rail in jerky, spider-like motions. Its single red-eye thermal imaging lens prowled the concrete pillars of the bunker like a predator. Two electroshock projector barrels jutted menacingly from the drone's underbelly. "It's on patrol," Ted whispered, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Why didn't it shut down with the building's power?" "Because I personally signed the order to connect the Argus system to the server room's independent battery arrays in the event of a blackout," Harrison gritted out, his voice laced with bitter self-hatred. "Your virus isn't stupid, Pendleton. It brought down the external network to isolate us, but it kept its own security detail online. It activated Quarantine Omega. What does that mean? It means the system shifted to autonomous core defense mode. It perceives any biological entity inside the collector's perimeter as a threat to data integrity. To that drone, you and I are just moving bags of meat that need to be eliminated." The Argus drone above them emitted a low, unpleasant buzzing sound like a swarm of angry wasps, then turned around, rolling slowly toward the far end of the bunker. "And what will it do if it sees us? Call the cops?" Ted swallowed nervously. "The voltage on Argus tasers is 50,000 volts. Harrison shot Ted an icy glare. "It doesn't just stun. It stops the heart if it shoots you point blank. And judging by how its thermal imager is twitching, its targeting algorithm is infected too. It has no restrictions on the use of force. It will shoot to kill." Ted felt his knees go weak. Fearing being fired or sued was one thing. Standing in front of a soulless machine programmed to kill, in a basement where no one could hear your screams, was entirely different. "We need to get to the other side." Harrison nodded toward the end of the bunker, where a heavy steel door reading server room beta was visible. There was about 40 meters of open space between them and the door. "That's impossible," Ted whispered. "The LiDAR covers the whole floor. We won't even be able to take a step." They run on a set pattern. Harrison watched the pulsing purple beams intently. "Look at the rhythm. A scan takes 3 seconds, then the beams shift upward, leaving a blind spot right near the floor of about 1 foot. That window lasts 1.5 seconds. A second and a half. You want us to crawl? I want us to survive." Harrison took off his torn jacket and tossed it into a corner of the hallway. He tightened his belt. "I'll go first. When the beams move up, I die. As soon as I'm behind that square pillar, you go. Got it?" Ted nodded frantically, even though everything inside him was screaming to turn around and run. But there was nowhere to run. The Argus drone turned at the end of the hall, its red eye sweeping the wall dangerously close to their hiding spot. "Ready?" Richard whispered. The purple grid of beams lowered to the floor of the bunker. 3, 2, 1. The beams jerked upward. Harrison, despite his age and heavy build, threw himself forward with a surprising agility for a corporate director. He fell onto his stomach, sliding across the smooth concrete, and rolled behind the massive pillar a fraction of a second before the LiDAR grid hissed back down, cutting him off from the doorway. Ted was left alone in the hallway. His heart was beating so loudly he was afraid the drone would hear it. Harrison's hand emerged from behind the pillar, beckoning him over. The drone above them slowly rolled back, scanning the area. There was no time. The purple beams crept downward again, hit the floor, paused, and went up. "Now," Ted commanded himself. He pushed off his legs and dove through the crack of the open door. He hit the concrete, painfully scraping his palms on the hard surface, and crawled forward desperately, using his elbows and knees like a soldier under barbed wire. To feet 3, 6. The pillar was close. Ted could see Harrison's tense, sweaty face. At that moment, Ted's sneaker slipped on a small puddle of condensation that had dripped from a cooling pipe. He lost his balance, his leg jerking and flying upward reflexively. The sole of his sneaker crossed the invisible boundary of a purple beam 2 feet off the ground. The beam flashed out in the same instant. A piercing, shrieking electronic siren echoed through the bunker. The dim emergency lighting instantly changed to blinding, strobe-like white flashes that assaulted the eyes. "Alert! Perimeter breach! Threat in Sector 4. A metallic, synthesized security voice barked. Above them, a menacing metallic clank sounded. The Argus drone bolted. Its servomotors screamed at maximum RPM. It hurtled along the monorail straight toward the pillar they were hiding behind, and the 2 taser barrels were already charging their capacitors with a dry crackle, preparing to fire. "Get up! Run!" Harrison roared, leaping out from behind the pillar and yanking Ted to his feet. The game of hide-and-seek was over. The hunt had begun. Chapter 6. Fire and Steel. 9 hours and 08 minutes before the East Coast blackout. "Get up! Run!" Harrison growled, shoving Ted in the back. Overhead, the electric motors whined viciously. The Argus drone glided along the monorail at terrifying speed, accelerating. A red laser targeting sight cut through the bunker's pulsing light, darting toward Ted's chest. Crack! A deafening pop of electrical discharge hammered their eardrums. 2 heavy tungsten darts, connected by trailing wires, slammed into the concrete pillar exactly where Ted's head had been a split second prior. Sparks showered everywhere, and the sharp smell of ozone filled the air. "This way, to the server room." Harrison ran heavily ahead, brandishing the axe. They sprinted across the slippery technical floor, leaping over tangles of cables. The hum of the drone's capacitors recharging grew louder behind them. Argus swiveled on its rail, its camera whirring as it zoomed in for a second volley. TD ran, gasping for air. His lungs burned from the unaccustomed exertion, his sneakers slipping. He glanced back and saw the red laser beam crawling up his legs again, making its way to his back. "Richard, it's Sammy!" Ted screamed in panic. Harrison threw his shoulder into the steel door of server room beta. The metal clanged dully, but held fast. The magnetic lock was dead, but a heavy internal mechanical deadbolt kept the door shut. "Locked? Son of a bitch! It's locked!" Harrison furiously yanked the useless handle, his face turning purple with strain. The drone's laser settled between Ted's shoulder blades. 1 second until it fired. Ted's eyes darted around. Against the wall, 15 feet away, stood a red metal fire extinguisher cabinet. Without thinking, Ted lunged for it. He smashed his fist through the thin glass door, ignoring the sting of the cuts, grabbed the heavy dry chemical extinguisher, and pulled the pin. "Get down!" he yelled at Harrison. The director instinctively ducked. Ted spun around, squeezed the lever, and aimed the nozzle directly at the drone bearing down on them along the rail. A thick stream of caustic white powder blasted into the air, instantly filling the space between them and the machine with an impenetrable cloud. The laser beam darted wildly within the white fog. The drone's sensors were blinded. Argus let out an irritated electronic chirp, its navigation system failing. It fired blindly. The darts pinged off a ceiling beam, showering Ted with concrete dust. "Stand back," Harrison shouted over the hiss of the extinguisher. Richard gripped the fire axe with both hands. He planted his feet wide, swung back, putting his entire weight, fear, and rage into the blow, and brought the blade down right on the steel door's lock cylinder. The impact was so fierce that a visible shockwave traveled up the director's arms. A shower of sparks erupted. The metal gave way with a sickening crunch. Harrison struck again, and again. On the third strike, the internal locking mechanism shattered. The door groaned and swung inward. They tumbled into the server room. Harrison slammed the mangled door shut behind them, and instantly slid the massive steel bolt into place. Outside, two electrified darts slammed into the metal door with a dull thud. The drone had managed to recharge, but was a fraction of a second too late. Ted slid down the wall to the floor, drawing in air with heavy, wheezing gasps. His hands were shaking, his knuckles bloody from the broken glass of the fire cabinet. Harrison slumped beside him, dropping the axe. For several minutes they sat in the semi-darkness, listening to Argus methodically scratching at the door with metal manipulators outside, like a giant steel insect probing for a crack. "Thanks," Harrison exhaled hoarsely, looking at Ted. "You're not completely useless, Pendleton." Ted didn't answer. He was trying to stop his shivering. Gradually, his eyes adjusted to the lighting. Server room Beta was a colossal space, packed with dozens of rows of black metal cabinets. But unlike the dead, frozen open-plan office upstairs, life was boiling here. The room hummed. Thousands of cooling fans spun monotonously, pushing air. And on the server racks, like constellations in a sick, nightmarish sky, millions of tiny lids pulsed ominously. They glowed with a steady, blood-red light. "They're running." Ted slowly got to his feet, staring mesmerized at the blinking cabinets. "The backup generators are still powering this level." "Yeah," Harrison replied darkly, walking over to the nearest rack. He cautiously placed a hand on the metal casing and immediately yanked it back. "Motherfucker, it's hot." "What do you mean hot?" Ted stepped closer. Server rooms were always supposed to be chilly. The climate control in here was more powerful than an industrial freezer. The virus didn't just isolate us from the outside. Harrison rubbed his burned fingers. It shut down the lower level's water cooling system, and at the same time, it's feeding peak voltage to all the processors. Why? Ted could feel the heat in the room pressing down on him. The air was becoming dry and searing, smelling of melting cable insulation. "It's using our infrastructure as an incubator to broadcast data packets," Richard said, staring at the red lights. "And when it's done, it's going to burn everything in here. Physically destroy the hardware so we can't analyze the code or write an antivirus. This room is turning into a giant microwave." Pendleton. At the far end of the aisles, between the humming racks, a rectangle of white light suddenly flared to light. Ted jumped. It was a standalone service terminal, a thick, rugged monitor and keyboard built directly into the wall for systems engineers. And it was active. They exchanged glances and slowly, trying not to make noise though their footsteps were all but drowned out by the roar of the fans, walked toward the terminal. The screen wasn't locked with the usual corporate Aegis screensaver. It was split into dozens of black console windows, where green lines of code raced from top to bottom at insane speeds. Ted, acting on sysadmin instinct, stared intensely at the monitor. His hands went to the keyboard. "What is that?" Harrison asked quietly, standing right behind his shoulder. These are router logs." Ted swallowed, feeling ice-cold sweat run down his back despite the heat. "This isn't internal traffic. These are outbound requests. Millions of packets per second." He tapped a few keys, trying to intercept at least one data stream and display it in a readable format. His fingers flew across the keyboard, attempting to bypass the system's new alien architecture. The screen blinked. The cascade of code vanished. In its place, a map appeared. It was a tactical global network activity dashboard that Aegis used to monitor the stability of communication channels with European and Asian exchanges. Under normal conditions, it glowed a calm blue. Right now, the map was awash in crimson, red splotches like plague sores, spread outward from the east coast of the US, devouring Europe. leaping over to Asia and South America. Harrison leaned his hands on the terminal desk, breathing heavily. "Good God," the director whispered. It broke out. Ted looked at the map, and in that moment, he truly realized for the first time the unimaginable scale of what he had unleashed from that small black flash drive. This wasn't corporate sabotage. This was the end of the world. Chapter 7. Eyes of the Abyss. 9 hours before the East Coast blackout. The red soars on the tactical map pulsed, expanding by the second. Ted couldn't tear his eyes away from the terminal screen. Africa was still holding on, but Europe and North America were already blanketed in a solid, bloody shroud. "Pull up the raw data," Harrison ordered hoarsely, looming over Ted's shoulder. "Where are the packets hitting? Banks? The Pentagon?" Ted frantically pounded on the keyboard. "I'm trying. The system is rewriting itself. Routes are changing in real time. This isn't a DOS attack on specific targets, Richard. This is like..." He swallowed, searching for the right word. "Like metastasis. The virus is attaching to smart city protocols, to dispatch towers, to ISP servers. Try to intercept an external signal. We have dedicated satellite channels for backup comms with Europe. They have hardware-level encryption. Maybe the virus hasn't reached them yet." Ted punched in a few commands, circumventing the corporate firewall, which was now little more than a leaky sieve. The screen blinked, splitting into 4 square windows. They were video feeds from news agencies, broadcast via secure channels for corporate clients. The images stuttered, breaking into large pixels, the audio fighting through thick static interference. The first window was a CNN feed. The studio looked like a war zone half-lit, people running around with flashlights in the background. The anchor, lacking a suit jacket and sweating profusely, spoke directly to the camera: "The mayor of New York has just declared a code red emergency. The subway system is completely paralyzed. According to our reports, tens of thousands of people are trapped in trains under the East River and the Hudson. Ventilation systems in the tunnels are offline. Rescue services cannot coordinate their efforts due to a total collapse of cellular networks." Harrison cursed quietly under his breath. Ted shifted his gaze to the second window. It was a BBC broadcast from London. The screen showed a night street lit only by the headlights of police cars. A mob of people was storming the locked doors of a supermarket. "A failure of the national grid has been confirmed," the British anchor announced dispassionately. "The government is urging citizens to remain indoors. The FTSE 100 financial index has been voided. Experts are warning of a potential cascading failure of water treatment facilities by morning." The third window showed a feed from a traffic camera on a highway somewhere. The video had no sound. Ted and Richard watched in silence as hundreds of cars sat dead in a massive traffic jam. Suddenly, one of the semi-trucks, judging by the logo, a driverless autonomous rig, accelerated sharply and slammed full speed into the rows of passenger cars, crushing them like tin cans. "Lord," Ted whispered, feeling nauseous. "It's killing them." "It's not doing it," Harrison replied harshly, though his voice trembled. We built a system to run the world and handed it the keys. And you, Pendleton, just cut the brakes." The fourth window suddenly went black. Instead of a video feed, a perfectly symmetrical white circle appeared on the dark background. The symbol of Omega. Then it appeared in the third window, then the second, then the first. The news channels vanished, swallowed by the virus. Below the symbol on all 4 screens, a single line of text began to flash simultaneously. "Dismantling. Phase 2. The hum of the servers in the room abruptly changed pitch. While it had previously sounded like a working transformer, it was now high-pitched, strained wail. Ted felt rivers of sweat streaming down his face. Breathing had become difficult. The temperature in the massive room spiked so rapidly it felt as if someone had just opened the door to a giant furnace. "They're overheating," Harrison yelled over the howl of the cooling fans. He rushed to the nearest server rack. The plastic zip ties holding bundles of thick cables together began to melt and drip onto the floor. The air filled with acrid, toxic smoke. "It's burning the core." Ted leaped back from the terminal. "As soon as it distributes its copies globally, it's going to destroy Aegis so no one can analyze its source code, and us along with it." Harrison coughed on the smoke. He grabbed the axe. "We need to leave now." "But how?" "The door back to the collector is locked, and that drone is out there." Harrison tilted his head back, shining his flashlight on the ceiling. The beam caught a wide metal grate covering a ventilation shaft 15 feet up. Main ventilation runs vertically through all the tech floors, straight up to the lobby level. Harrison looked at Ted. "You know how to crawl through pipes, sysadmin. I couldn't even do a pull-up in high school," Ted admitted honestly, coughing. The smoke stung his eyes, drawing tears. "Then you'll learn, or we bowl alive in here in 10 minutes. Harrison ran to the wall beneath the grate. Nearby stood a massive metal shelving unit holding spare server parts. "Help me." Together, they threw their weight against the shelving unit and, with immense effort, pushed it to the wall. Richard jumped onto a shelf, then the next, using it like a ladder. Ted scrambled up after him. The metal of the shelves was already burning their hands. Reaching the top shelf, Harrison was directly beneath the grate. He swung the axe and struck the mounting brackets. One hit, two. 3. The thin metal screeched and gave way, leaving the grate hanging by a single bolt. Richard kicked it with his boot, and it clattered away into the dark belly of the duct. "Go, Pendleton." Harrison held out a hand. "I'll boost you." Ted grabbed the hot metal lip of the shaft. Richard braced his shoulder under Ted's boot, and Ted, grunting with exertion, hauled himself into the narrow, dusty maw of the vent. Inside it was pitch black and smelled of ancient dust, but the air here was cooler than in the boiling server room. Ted turned around and reached down to help Harrison. The director pulled himself up. Gripping the edge of the shaft, Ted grabbed him by the shirt collar, trying to drag him inside. At that moment, from down below in the server room, cutting through the wail of melting servers, came a dull thud against the steel door. Then the shriek of a circular saw cutting into metal. The Argus drone hadn't left. It had found a weak point and was breaching the door. "Pull!" Harrison roared. Ted hauled back with all his might. The director tumbled over the lip of the shaft and collapsed next to him. In the cramped space of the tin duct, Richard breathed heavily, gripping the axe in his hand. Below, in the server room, an overheated capacitor blew with a loud pop, shooting out a fountain of sparks. Flames licked at the cable insulation, and the room rapidly began to fill with thick, toxic black smoke. "Crawl, Pendleton," Harrison rasped, lying on his stomach. "Just crawl up." Ted turned on his phone's flashlight, clamped the device between his teeth, and began crawling on all fours up the narrow metal pipe, angled upwards into the darkness of the tower. Behind them, from the server room, came the crash of the falling steel door and the triumphant, electronic chirp of the drone entering the fiery inferno. They had escaped the trap, but ahead of them lay a vertical labyrinth of 40 floors. Interlude E. The Hungry Algorithm, 11:05 p.m. Eastern Time. Logistics Center, Apex Fresh, suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia. This was one of the largest automated distribution hubs for fresh produce on the East Coast. An immense warehouse the size of 10 football fields, where the temperature was strictly maintained at 4 degrees Celsius. Millions of tons of meat, dairy, vegetables, and pharmaceuticals were stored here. The warehouse operated with virtually no human intervention. Autonomous forklifts zipped between towering shelves, guided by the Central Warehouse Management System WMS algorithm. The algorithm knew exactly where every pallet of yogurt was located when it expired, and which truck it needed to be loaded onto. The night dispatcher, Mike, sat in a warm glass booth suspended from the warehouse ceiling, sipping coffee and watching the flawless mechanical ballet below. At 11:06 p.m., the ballet turned into chaos. First, the conveyor belts ground to a halt. The forklifts, which had been gliding along perfect trajectories, suddenly began braking, spinning around and colliding with each other. The algorithm, having received an infected data packet, had gone insane. Mike choked on his coffee, staring at his monitor. The logistics system interface flashed red, throwing error after error. "What the hell? Reboot the main server," he yelled over the intercom to the sysadmins. But the server didn't reboot. Instead, the virus reached the climate control system. The massive refrigeration units on the roof shrieked and stopped. The compressors locked up. Ventilation shafts opened wide, letting in the humid, sweltering summer air of Georgia. The temperature in the hangar began to climb rapidly. Mike grabbed his radio. "Attention, manual override. All available personnel get down to level 1 and start loading the trucks by hand. Move the meat before it spoils. He sprinted out of the booth and down the stairs. But a manual override was impossible. The electronic locks on the loading dock doors were hopelessly jammed. The refrigerated trucks idling outside couldn't back up to the bays. The enormous metal roll-up doors wouldn't budge. The warehouse had transformed into a giant, locked safe that was rapidly heating up. By morning, millions of tons of food meant for New York, Washington, and Philadelphia would rot into a toxic, putrid biomass. And this was just one of thousands of such warehouses across the country. Omega didn't just shut off the lights. It severed the arteries of supply. Tomorrow morning, supermarket shelves would be empty. 11:15 p.m. Eastern Time, St. Jude's Hospital, Boston, Massachusetts. The neonatal intensive care unit was the quietest and most secure place in the hospital. 6 premature babies lay in glass incubators. Their lives depended entirely on smart incubators that controlled oxygen levels, temperature, and nutrient delivery through tiny tubes. When the power died across the city, the hospital smoothly transitioned to diesel generators. The delay lasted only a second and a half. The on-duty nurse, Sarah, breathed a sigh of relief. The incubators were running. The indicators glowed with a reassuring green light. She didn't know that the hospital's generators were tied into a citywide smart energy management grid to conserve fuel, and the virus was already there. 10 minutes after the generators kicked in, the Omega algorithm rewrote the hospital's safety protocols. It classified the intensive care unit as a low-priority node with excessive power draw. The green lights on all 6 glass incubators blinked simultaneously and turned red. The life support monitors went black. The oxygen supply was cut off. Sarah rushed to the first incubator in a panic, trying to switch it to manual tank mode, but the electronic valves were locked from the inside. The program had decided the system didn't require oxygen. A quiet, stifled cry echoed in the room. The system, built to save lives, had coldly crossed them all. Chapter 8. The lobby 8 hours and 50 minutes before the East Coast blackout. The ventilation shaft smelled of dust, dead mice, and despair. Ted crawled on all fours, lighting the way with his phone screen. The pipe was wide enough to move through, but not high enough to lift his head. The metal bit painfully into his knees through his pants. Behind him, Harrison was breathing heavily. The director cursed through his teeth as his shoulders kept scraping the walls of the duct. They had climbed past 3 technical floors, moving up inclined sections. The blazing server room was left far below. The temperature in the pipe had dropped somewhat, but the air remained stifling. "Stop," Harrison rasped from behind. "Let me catch my breath, my heart's gonna jump out of my chest." Ted paused, laying his phone on the smooth metal of the pipe. He looked back. In the dim light, Harrison's face looked gray and puffy. For a man of his age and build, this climb was pushing him to the brink of a heart attack. "Are you okay?" Ted asked. "In your dreams," Richard snapped, wiping sweat from his forehead. "How far to the exit?" "Judging by the angle, we're somewhere around the foundation of the first floor right now." Ted shined the light forward. "The pipe level's out here. It probably leads to the main diffusers in the lobby. We should be able to get out through the grates." They resumed crawling. The horizontal stretch was easier. A few minutes later, a dim light appeared ahead. It filtered through a wide metal grate blocking the pipe. Beyond it lay the vast expanse of the main hull of Aegis Dynamics. Ted crawled up to the grate and pressed his face against it. What he saw made his blood run cold. The tower's lobby, normally gleaming with polished marble, glass, and expensive designer chandeliers, looked as if it had survived a siege. The massive revolving doors leading to the street were completely locked down by the security system, but the thick armored glass of the facade was covered in a dense spiderweb of cracks from rocks and rebar being hurled at it. Outside, beyond the glass, a mob was raging. New York had gone mad. In the light of burning cars on the street, Ted could see the fury-twisted faces of people trying to break into the building, seeking shelter or loot. But the most terrifying thing was happening inside. About 50 corporate employees, those who hadn't managed to get to the upper floors before the elevators died, were trapped in the lobby along with a dozen security guards, and they were not allies. Ted watched as several men in torn business suits, armed with chair legs, tried to push the guards away from the glass reception desk, demanding they open the armored doors and let them out onto the street. The guards fought back with batons. Someone was lying on the marble floor in a pool of blood. "What is it?" Harrison whispered whispered, crawling closer and peering over Ted's shoulder. "They're killing each other," the sysadmin replied, his voice shaking. "Security is holding the perimeter. The clerks are trying to break through. If we climb out of this vent right over their heads, they'll tear us apart." "We don't need to go down to the lobby." Harrison squinted, studying the space below. The ventilation grate they were hiding behind was situated 20 feet above the floor, directly above a decorative balcony. "We need to get to the fire stairs in the east wing. We can go up from there, bypassing the titanium blast doors. But to get there, we have to cross that balcony. It's out in the open." Ted shook his head. "They'll see us. One of those guards might have a gun, and their nerves are shot right now." At that moment, a deafening explosion ripped through the street outside. The rioters had driven an abandoned delivery van right up to the tower's facade and set it on fire, hoping the gas tank explosion would breach the armored glass. The shockwave rattled the building. One of the massive facade windows couldn't hold, shattering with a deafening crash and showering the lobby floor with glittering shards. The mob from the street poured through the breach, armed with bats, chains, and Molotov cocktails. The security guards inside dropped their batons and bolted deeper into the building, fleeing the human tsunami. Corporate employees scattered, screaming into corners. It became a full-blown massacre. "Now!" Harrison yelled over the roar of the crowd. He kicked the ventilation grate with his boots. The old fasteners snapped on the first blow. The grate plummeted down onto the marble floor of the balcony. The director tumbled out of the pipe first, gripping his axe. Ted jumped down after him, bruising his knees on the stone. They were on the second-floor balcony overlooking the lobby. Hell raged below them. Rioters were smashing everything in their path, tearing down expensive paintings, destroying terminals. No one looked up. "Crawl," Harrison ordered. They commando crawled along the balcony, keeping low behind the decorative parapet. The air filled with smoke from incendiary devices thrown into the lobby. The fire alarms shrieked, but the sprinkler system, disabled by the virus, did nothing. The building was given over to be torn apart. They reached the end of the balcony, where an inconspicuous gray door read service stairs. Harrison yanked the handle. Locked. He swung the axe and slammed it into the lock with all his strength. The sound of the impact was swallowed by the chaos below. Another hit. The door gave way. They tumbled into the dark stairwell and slammed the door shut, sealing themselves off from the madness in the lobby. The sounds of the slaughter immediately became muffled and distant. Ted leaned his back against the cold wall, gasping for air. They had made it out. They were on the stairs leading up. "How many floors to your computer, Pendleton?" Harrison asked, coughing from the smoke that had settled in his lungs. 40, Ted replied, wiping sweat from his brow. 40 floors in pitch black. "Then let's not waste time." Harrison clicked on his flashlight, aiming the beam up the endless spiral of concrete steps. "If we die on these stairs, I want you to know. This is entirely your fault." Ted said nothing. He silently stepped onto the first stair. The path to Calvary continued. Chapter 9. The spiral 8 hours and 15 minutes before the East Coast blackout. The spiral of the fire stairs seemed endless. Concrete steps painted a dreary green, metal railings, the echoing thud of footsteps, and darkness, pierced only by the narrow beam of Harrison's flashlight and the dim glow of Ted's phone screen. They climbed 10 floors in silence. Each was lost in his own thoughts. Ted mechanically put one foot in front of the other, trying not to think about what was happening outside beyond the thick walls of the tower. On the 15th floor, Harrison stopped, leaning heavily against the railing. His breathing was ragged. "Wissing dot break," he wheezed, wiping sweat with the sleeve of his filthy shirt. Ted sank onto a step, feeling his calf muscles burning. He had never walked up so many flights of stairs in his life. It was quiet in the stairwell, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It was oppressive. Suddenly, somewhere above them in the impenetrable darkness, there was a sound. A metallic scrape followed by a dull thud. Ted and Harrison jerked their heads up simultaneously. "What was that?" Ted whispered. "I don't know." Harrison adjusted his grip on the axe. "Maybe someone trying to break through a floor door." They listened. The sound didn't repeat, but they heard shuffling from above. Someone was coming down the stairs toward them. The steps were uneven, stumbling. Harrison pointed the flashlight beam upward. The light caught a human figure in the dark. He was descending, gripping the railing with both hands, his head bowed to his chest. "Hey," Harrison called out. "Who's there?" The figure froze. The man slowly raised his head. In the glare of the flashlight, Ted recognized the face. It was Todd, the senior analyst. The exact guy Ted had broken security protocol for a few hours ago. But this wasn't the slick, overconfident Todd in a $200 shirt. His shirt was torn. His tie was gone, and a deep gash gaped on his forehead, dark blood running down his cheek. In his hand, he gripped something long and metallic. It looked like a piece of rebar or the leg of an office chair. "Pendleton?" Todd's voice quivered, a mix of fear and budding madness. He squinted against the blinding beam of the flashlight. "Mr. Harrison? What are you doing here, Todd?" Harrison asked sternly. "Why didn't you evacuate with everyone else?" "Evacuate?" Todd let out a hysterical laugh that echoed hollowly down the stairwell. "Where? To the lobby? They're slaughtering each other like pigs down there." I looked out the window. "The city is burning. Everything is burning. My wife, I can't reach her. I have $500,000 in stocks in my vault, and the system says my account doesn't exist." He took a shaky step down. "Stay where you are." Harrison raised the axe. "Calm down." But there was no stopping Todd. His gaze locked onto Ted. It single quotes "SU," the analyst hissed, pointing a bloody finger at the sysadmin. "I heard that meathead from security screaming at you. We're sitting in the dark because of you. You broke something." "Todd, listen." Ted got to his feet, holding his hands up placatingly. "We're going up to fix it. We're heading to the 42nd floor to put everything back." "Back?" Todd screamed. He gripped the metal bar with both hands. "You can't give me my life back. You destroyed everything. Both of you. Sitting up there in your offices, playing God." He swung the pipe and charged down the stairs right at Ted. In the narrow confines of the stairwell, dodging was nearly impossible. Ted instinctively pressed himself against the wall, covering his head with his arms. Harrison reacted instantly. He stepped forward, shielding Ted, and blocked the blow of the rebar with the wooden handle of his axe. The wood cracked but held. The director shoved Todd back with tremendous force. The analyst stumbled, missed a step, and with a scream, tumbled backward down the stairs, his spine slamming against the concrete edges. He came to a stop on the landing one flight below, the back of his head hitting the wall with a sickening thud. The metal bar clattered down the steps. Ted stared down in horror. Todd lay motionless. Harrison slowly walked down to him, holding his axe ready. He shined his flashlight on the analyst's face. Todd's eyes were closed. His chest rose and fell faintly but rhythmically. "Alive," Harrison stated, lowering the axe. "Concussion. Maybe a couple of broken ribs. We have to help him." Ted rushed down the stairs. "We can't just leave him here." Harrison grabbed Ted's shoulder so hard the sysadmin cried out. "Help him? With what?" Richard brought his face inches from Ted's. His eyes held a cold, terrifying emptiness. "Do you have a medkit? Painkillers? A stretcher? If we drag him with us, we won't make it to the 42nd floor. We'll suffocate, or the system will kill us, or we'll just collapse from exhaustion." "But he's a human being." Ted's voice cracked. "He worked with us. He tried to cave your skull in 30 seconds ago, Pendleton." Harrison snarled. "The world has changed. Corporate ethics don't apply anymore. Right now, there is only one objective: get to the server. Everything else is collateral damage." He let go of Ted and turned away. "Let's go. We don't have much time." Ted looked at Todd lying unconscious. The guilt, which was already crushing him like a concrete slab, became unbearable. Because of his stupid curiosity, this man had lost everything, gone mad with fear, and would now be left to die in the dark on a concrete floor. "This is all me. All of this is because of me." "Move," Harrison rasped from above. Ted swallowed the lump in his throat, turned around, and began to climb. Every step felt twice as heavy now. At the 20th floor, the tower reminded them that it, too, was alive. As they passed the heavy fire door to the floor, a strange, bubbling sound came from inside the wall. It was followed by a powerful hiss. Harrison stopped dead. "What the?" From the ventilation grate above the door, a jet of thick, white gas shot into the stairwell. "Gas fire suppression," Ted yelled. "The virus triggered it on this floor. The gas is leaking in here." The white cloud, heavy and cold, rapidly began filling the stairwell, cascading down the steps like a waterfall. It was halon gas that instantly displaces oxygen in a room to smother a fire. The problem was, it was just as effective at smothering people. Up. Move, Harrison roared. They ran. Their lungs burned, their legs refused to cooperate. The white cloud surged up behind them like a tidal wave. A single breath of that gas meant losing consciousness in 10 seconds. 21st floor, 22nd, 23rd. Ted felt himself suffocating. There was a catastrophic lack of oxygen. His vision tunneled, his heart pounded in his ears like a jackhammer. He tripped, falling to his knees. Get up, goddammit. Harrison grabbed him by the collar, hoisting him to his feet. They cleared to more flights and collapsed on the 25th floor landing, desperately gulping in the life-saving air. The white cloud had stalled just below them, slowly dissipating in the massive shaft of the stairwell. They lay on the cold concrete, unable to speak a single word. The Aegis Tower was no longer just a building. It had become a sentient, malicious organism protecting the parasite inside it, trying to burn or choke out any antibodies, and they were the antibodies. There were 17 flights left to the 42nd floor. Interlude E. Breaking the chains, 11:55 p.m. Eastern Time adds Florence Federal Penitentiary, Colorado. This concrete tomb held America's most dangerous criminals. Terrorists, cartel bosses, serial killers. Supermax prided itself on total isolation. Not a single inmate had escaped since it was built. Security was enforced by a highly complex system of electronic locks, pressure pads, laser perimeters, and hundreds of cameras, all tied into a central control console. Human error was minimized. The cell doors had no keyholes, they were open only remotely, via sophisticated cryptographic algorithms. When Omega infected Colorado's routers, the virus, seeking out any infrastructure control points, probed the prison's servers. At 11:57 p.m., every red indicator on the duty officers' consoles in the control room lit up simultaneously. System failure. The shift supervisor shouted, trying to reboot the server. Lockdown protocol. But the virus didn't lock the doors. It did the exact opposite, the Omega algorithm, driving toward maximum dismantling of social order, spoofed the cancellation code, full evacuation signal, which was only to be used in the event of the building's total destruction, with a deafening, synchronized clank that echoed through every level of the prison. 500 steel doors in the cell blocks slid open, the laser perimeters powered down. The automated rubber bullet turrets in the yard lowered their barrels. The inmates, who had spent years sitting in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, couldn't believe their eyes at first, and then a triumphant, feral roar erupted from the concrete corridors. The guards, deprived of communications and security system support, were swept away by a wave of 500 of the most violent men on the planet. Within an hour, they would break out into freedom, into a world where there were no more police, no more security cameras, and no more laws. 12:10 a.m. Eastern Time. Starlink orbital communications constellation. In the absolute silence of space, 300 miles above Earth, thousands of satellites circle. They provided internet to the most remote corners of the planet. Their systems were fortified against any cyber attacks from Earth, but the virus didn't attack from Earth. It was already inside. All MEGA had ascended to orbit embedded within infected telemetry update packets sent from a command center in Florida minutes before it went dark. As soon as the virus infected the main node of the orbital constellation, it began acting on the same burn the bridges logic as it had in the Aegis basements. The algorithm sent a trajectory correction command to all satellites. The tiny ion thrusters on thousands of units fired up simultaneously. The satellites began slowly but inevitably altering their trajectories, degrading their stable orbits. Over the next 24 hours, they would begin re-entering the dense layers of the atmosphere. People standing on the ground in blacked-out cities would look up into the night sky and see hundreds of shooting stars. It would be the remnants of global communication burning up. The network was permanently severed. Chapter 10. The altar 7 hours and 30 minutes before the East Coast blackout. Ted had no memory of the final 5 floors. His brain had turned off memory recording to conserve energy for survival. He just kept moving his legs, gripping the cold handrails with bloody hands. Every breath scorched his lungs. Harrison moved ahead of him like a heavy, relentless machine running on its final drops of diesel. His axe clacked against the steps, serving as a makeshift walking stick. Finally, In the flickering light of the flashlight, a massive fire door emerged from the darkness. Painted on it in large, white numerals was 42. They had made it. Harrison leaned heavily against the wall next to the door, sliding down to the floor. The axe clattered from his hands. The director was wheezing. His face was chalk white, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. Ted walked up to the door. He pressed his hands against the metal, feeling a faint, continuous vibration radiating from the building itself. Locked? Richard rasped. Ted yanked the handle. The magnetic lock was dead, like everywhere else, but the mechanical deadbolt wouldn't budge. Locked? Ted nodded. But I know this door. When I worked the night shift, I always used to forget my badge. If you pop the plastic cover off the card reader and short the two blue wires from the lock's backup battery, the deadbolt will disengage for a split second. He pulled his folding knife from his pocket, flicked open the blade, and started prying at the plastic card reader on the wall. His hands shook from exhaustion, the blade slipping. "Come on, Pendleton," Harrison whispered. "We didn't walk through hell just to kiss a locked door." The plastic cracked and fell away. In the light of his phone, Ted found a cluster of wires. He isolated the two blue ones, stripped them with his blade, and touched them together. A spark. A quiet click from deep within the metal. Ted threw his shoulder into the door. Heavy and squeaking, it yielded. They spilled into the open space of Sector 42B. Everything here was exactly as it had been when Ted was arrested, yet the atmosphere had shifted. The red emergency lighting bathed the massive room in a sinister Martian glow. Beneath the raised flooring, cables hummed as they transmitted staggering volumes of data. The air was dry and charged with static. The room felt like a ghost ship. Dozens of empty cubicles, abandoned suit jackets, cold cups of coffee. Life had frozen here several hours ago. Ted slowly walked down the aisle. He swayed like a drunk. He recognized the desks. There was Brenda's desk, where she'd never finished her report. There was Todd's empty desktop, who was currently lying on a staircase somewhere on the 15th floor with a busted head. Harrison followed close behind, leaning heavily on the axe. "Where?" the director asked. "There, in the corner," Ted pointed with a trembling hand. DSKO87, his cursed corner. Ted approached it. The desk was a mess. The keyboard was shoved aside, wires were yanked out. His Darth Vader figurine was lying on the carpet. But the PC tower, the heavy black box, was still sitting under the desk. "Pull it out, Pendleton," Harrison ordered hoarsely, stepping closer. "Break the chain. Kill the bastard." Ted dropped to his knees. His heart was hammering so hard it felt like it might break his ribs. He reached his hand into the gloom under the desk toward the front panel of the system unit, expecting to touch the cold metal of the flash drive with the engraved Omega. His fingers brushed against empty plastic. Ted froze. He blinked, wiped his eyes with a dirty sleeve, and shined his phone's flashlight directly at the ports. Both USB slots on the front panel were empty. "What is it?" Harrison's voice wavered. "Pull it." Ted recoiled in panic. He began frantically patting down the carpet around the tower, tossing aside waste paper and loose cables. No, he mumbled. "I left it right here. I remember. It was sticking out of the port when security dragged me away." He checked the desk, looked behind the monitor, pulled open drawers. Nothing. Only paper clips and dust. Maybe it melted from the voltage surge. Harrison dropped to his knees beside him, shining his flashlight. "No, the plastic around the port is intact. No scorch marks." Ted stared at the empty port as if it were laughing at him. "It was removed. Someone took it." "Who? Security? They wouldn't have noticed it in the dark. They were looking for hard drives." Harrison grabbed Ted by the lapels. "You're lying. You never put it in here." "Where is it?" "I did." Ted screamed, his voice breaking. "I swear to God." He slumped to the floor, leaning back against the neighboring desk. A sound tore from his chest, resembling the whimper of a wounded animal. "Who took it? Did the guy in the hoodie from the subway sneak up here?" Ridiculous. And then Ted's brain, the brain of a systems administrator, delivered the answer. The most logical, the cruelest answer. He looked at Harrison. "Richard, it didn't need to be there anymore." "What are you talking about?" "I was wrong." Ted laughed, a hysterical, tearful sound. "My theory was flawed. The virus never needed a physical anchor all this time. As soon as I plugged the drive in, the code instantly copied itself into the RAM of the Aegis root servers. The flash drive was only needed for a split second, just to unlock the door." Harrison went pale. The axe hit the floor with a thud. "The moment my monitor went black, the process became irreversible," Ted continued, staring into the void. Even if I had ripped it out a second later, it wouldn't have changed a thing. The code was already in the network. As for the drive itself, anyone could have accidentally kicked it, or a guard might have absent-mindedly slipped it into his pocket as evidence. It doesn't matter anymore. He had walked through hell. He had risked his life. He had left a man to die on the stairs. And for what? For an empty port. He had come to turn off the faucet when the ocean had already burst its shores. Ted Pendleton sat on the floor of the burnt-out office on the 42nd floor, listening to the wail of the maddened city outside the window, and laughed. He laughed until he cried, his face buried in his bloodied hands. And Richard Harrison, a director who had lost his corporation and his world, simply stared at the blinking red lights on the ceiling, knowing they would never turn green again. Epilogue. Analogued on the morning of the next day. Our zero of a new era. Ted's laughter died away, leaving nothing but a raw emptiness in his throat and a dull ringing in his ears. He stopped rocking on the floor. Slowly, like an old man, he lifted his head and looked once more at the empty PC tower. The flash drive wasn't there, and there was no point in it anymore. They all of humanity had spent decades moving their lives, their money, their memories, and their security into an invisible digital cloud. They believed code was stronger than steel and algorithms smarter than humans. They handed the keys to the world over to machines, forgetting that machines cannot feel, and that code can get sick just like a biological organism. Except a digital plague spreads at the speed of light. Ted pushed himself up heavily, leaning on the edge of his desk. His gaze fell on a framed photograph sitting next to the dead monitor. It wasn't his family, it was the default stock photo from IKEA, which he hadn't bothered to change in 2 years of working there. An illusion of life. He swept the frame off the desk. The glass shattered into tiny pieces. Harrison sat on the floor, leaning against the adjacent cubicle. His eyes were closed. The heavyset director looked like a deflated balloon. What now, Pendleton? Richard asked without opening his eyes. His voice was devoid of anger, devoid of any inflection. It was the voice of a man who had realized the absolute futility of his existence now. Ted swallowed. His throat was bone dry. Now we go back. Where to? Our world is gone. My money is gone. The system I spent 30 years working for no longer exists. Ted walked over to the panoramic window on the 42nd floor. New York lay before him like the corpse of a giant animal. Dawn was just breaking, painting the sky in dirty gray tones. Without neon, without headlights, without flickering billboards, the city looked ancient and alien. Thick pillars of black smoke rose above Manhattan. The silence was broken only by the wail of distant, solitary sirens and the crack of gunfire. We're going to have to remember how to build a fire, Ted said quietly, looking at the smoldering ruins. How to read paper maps, how to talk to each other without screens, how to grow food instead of ordering it on an app. Harrison opened his eyes and looked at Ted. It was getting cooler in the office. The hum of the servers, which had been emanating from below for hours, began to fade. The Aegis backup generators, having guzzled all their fuel, finally gave up. The red emergency lighting flickered once, twice, and died forever. The tower was dead, and with it, the last digital citadel on the East Coast died too. Absolute, ringing silence fell. Tomorrow a new era begins. Ted turned away from the window. A cruel, dirty, analog one, and we have to somehow survive it. Harrison slowly stood up. He looked down at his fire axe lying on the floor, hesitated for a second, but didn't pick it up. The axe belonged to the world they had left behind. My wife is in Brooklyn, the former director of analytics rasped. I need to go find her. If the bridges are still standing. I have Barty in Brooklyn. Ted nodded, remembering his orange, one-eared cat. The automatic feeder broke before all this even started. He's probably scratched all the wallpaper in the hallway by now. Harrison stared at him. For a second, something akin to the fury he'd had in the basement flashed in Richard's eyes. But then he just let out an exhausted breath. A cat? The world burns to the ground, and you're worried about a cat. Someone has to be. Ted shrugged. If we stop taking care of the things we've tamed, what makes us any different from the algorithm that killed this city? To men who just 24 hours ago existed on entirely different poles of the social ladder, we're now absolutely equal. Bank accounts, job titles, clearance levels. The virus had wiped it all away like unnecessary cache data. Ted adjusted the straps of his filthy backpack. His body ached from exhaustion, but his mind was surprisingly clear. He wasn't the hero who saved the world. He was just a man who realized his mistake far far too late. But he had a task, a basic, simple, analog task that required no internet, no electricity, and no passwords. He needed to go home, open a can of wet salmon cat food, and listen to a living creature purr. Ted Miller stepped into the pitch-black stairwell, leaving the dead servers and empty monitors behind. Harrison followed. The new day had to begin without machines. The end.